lesson is entitled Satan's Plan to Wreck the World. This is a series which we have been doing, which we'll bring to close the next few weeks. Looking at different ways in which Satan tries, you might say, to harm the Christian and to, in many ways, just to wreak havoc in the world. And one of those ways, is like we're looking at this morning, is through pain and suffering. And if you picked up a bulletin, you'll notice the bulletin article last week and this week and next week has been on pain and suffering, an article by Brother Chuck, who was here with us last week. So if you haven't picked one up, I encourage you to do so. When you think about pain and suffering, this morning I want to show how the pain and suffering oftentimes is used like a tool, you might say, by Satan to harm us, to discourage us, and do many things against us and really against those in the world. Is there anyone who has never endured any type of pain and suffering? Is there anyone even in this room who has never endured any type of pain or suffering? Maybe not just physically, but in an emotional state as well. We know that we can suffer and we can go through pain that is not physical many times in this life for various reasons. It may be because we have lost a son or a daughter, lost a friend, lost a spouse. Maybe whatever different reasons we can look at, we know that suffering is a part of life. It doesn't really matter if you're a Christian or not, you're going to suffer for various reasons. But we're going to look at this morning how the Christian has a little bit different outlook on life than those who do not when it comes to pain and suffering. Well, let's begin by looking at our text like Brother Doyle read just a moment ago. This really kind of goes along with what we're talking about. When we think about pain and suffering, an attitude that you see many times. That's what we'll see throughout this lesson, different attitudes concerning pain and suffering. In Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 1 he says, "Now return and consider all the oppression that is done under the sun, and look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter." Talking about looking at all the hardship, and they have no comfort from those things. Again, that's an attitude. You might say someone's way of looking at it. Verse 2 says, "Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." And so it seems the individual here is talking about that it'd be better not to even exist to see all the evil and all the pain and suffering that goes on in the world. It'd be a lot better if there wasn't any evil and pain and suffering, wouldn't there? But we know that's part of life because God has given man free will. We can act as we want. And many people, as we know today, full well, they act in ways which we just do not understand, inflicting harm and pain and suffering to various individuals throughout the world. Well, let's begin first by looking at how pain and suffering causes some to harden their disbelief in God. For the world, this is what pain and suffering does. They say, well, there's pain and suffering in the world, so there cannot be a God of the Bible. Some will mock the idea of God during a time of pain and suffering. Look at Job 26 and verse 2. It says, "Have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength?" That's the question many times people ask when during pain and suffering. Well, where is God at during all of this? You know, we talked about this before. What would the world be like if God didn't allow anything to happen to us ever? Well, what happens to the child that's spoiled? They turn into something we don't really enjoy, do they? Well, a person today, if God didn't allow anything bad to happen to them, some would say, well, we'd be happy. No, we wouldn't be happy. We'd find something else probably to complain about, because that's how mankind is. Even we are spared from pain and suffering, though we are not, that wouldn't be the answer. You see here in Job 26 and verse 2, he says, "How have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength?" Again, that's an attitude, that's an approach we need to take to God. Those in the world will turn to wickedness instead of God when suffering. Look at Zechariah chapter 10 and verse 2. He says, "For the idols speak delusion, the diviners envision lies and tell false dreams. They comfort in vain. Therefore the people wend their way like sheep. They are in trouble because there is no shepherd." You think about this for a moment. Why is there no shepherd for this person who goes to, see here in verse 2, he goes to the diviner, who goes to the person who speaks false dreams, a person who gives comfort in vain? Well, there's no shepherd because they're not going to God. They're going to these other areas, these other means, to false gods. You know, the internet is a scary place. But if you want to look at religion sometime and look at all the false gods that people can turn to, you'll be there a long time. Because people many times have the attitude of an atheist, anything but God, but the God of the Bible. We can see here in Zechariah chapter 10, this approach towards pain and suffering. They turn to false gods. Now today, when we think of a false god, we think of an idol, something that's gold, something that's been carved. And that's how it is in many places. But that's not how it is every time, is it? When someone turns on the television and listens to the advice of a worldly person over the godly advice we find in the Bible, and take their advice, their way of life, and make it their own, they have made that person their God, haven't they? Look again at Zechariah 10 and verse 2. He says, "And tell false dreams, and they comfort in vain." You know, what do you see sometimes late at night if you're up very late and you're flipping through the television? You see, well, first of all, you see a lot of those programs selling something, right? A knife that can cut through steel and a tomato or whatever else they try to show you. But you also have these guys who are trying, and ladies who are trying to be psychic and tell you to call them with their problems. You know, for $5 a minute, they'll talk to you. But what's interesting is not a lot of people anymore have a whole lot of stock in those things because they see that they're false. Now, we know we still see those things around here and there, but there's a mass amount of people who have really turned their backs on those types of things. They turn instead to the false gods of another religion. He says, "They comfort in vain. Therefore the people wend their way like sheep, and they are in trouble because there is no shepherd." Well, who is the shepherd which we need? Christ. Christ is the shepherd. He tells us He is the shepherd. He is the good shepherd. Pain and suffering also affects a person's outlook on life. That's a no-brainer, isn't it? A person who is suffering, it can affect their way of thinking. Pain and suffering cause a person, or cause some to question the need to even continue to live in this life. Look at Job 3 and verse 3. He says, "May the day perish in which I was born, and the night in which it was said a male child is conceived." He said he'd rather be dead than go through some of the things he's going through now. Now, if you remember the thing about Job, it wasn't just his physical ailments, was it? Job had someone else adding to his affliction. That was his 3 no-good friends, giving him a hard time for about 40 chapters throughout that entire book. So it wasn't just what he was enduring to show his faithfulness to God. It was because the loser friends he had around him. He's saying, "You're in sin, Job," when he hadn't done anything wrong. And he says in verse 3 here, the idea that death is better than this. He was suffering not just physically, he was suffering emotionally because his friends are saying you're in sin. He's defending himself. And so he's gone through a very difficult time. And he utters these words in verse 3, "May the day perish in which I was born." Pain and suffering can send some to a very dark place, a place that Satan doesn't mind you occupying. Look at Job chapter 6 and verse 11. He says, "What strength do I have that I should hope? And what is my end that I should prolong my life?" He's looking the wrong way, isn't he? This is part of the reason why we see Job repenting later, because his attitude gets a little off. I'm not say way off, and he starts talking about things like this, but his friends are saying things such as this as well. And so we see here pain and suffering can send some to a very dark place where they ask, "I just don't want to live anymore." And we know sometimes that it's pain and suffering, again, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually, can cause some to say, "I don't want anybody to come visit me. Don't call me. Don't do anything. I'm fine. Just want you to leave me alone." And what happens is many times they turn into what we call a hermit, and they go to a darker place where there is no return, and they never come out of it. And that's something that a Christian cannot do. But we think about a worldly person, and sometimes a Christian can fall into this category because of pain and suffering. They can start looking in the wrong direction. Pain and suffering affects those in the church. Pain and suffering can strengthen or weaken the Christian. You think about that, someone will say, well, how can suffering strengthen the Christian? What did the Apostle Paul talk about, his thorn in the flesh? He said he asked several times, 3 times I believe, for it to be removed, and it wasn't. But it didn't stop Paul from doing the will of God, to go out and continue preaching and teaching. Christians are warned about various trials, which include pain and suffering. Look at James 1, verses 2 through 4. He says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. He's not talking about just when you're being persecuted for a Christian. This would include pain and suffering. Trials and persecutions can be anything in life that can bring us or push us away from God if we allow them to do so. So he says in verse 2, he says, my brethren, count it all joy. That's hard to do when you're suffering. He says, but count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Knowing, now notice verse 3, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience, verse 4, have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. What is he talking about in verse 4? Endure through it and you'll actually be stronger when it's over with. Endure through those things. You know, hardships have the ability to push us away from God. But they also have the ability to push us closer to God. Paul recognized that he could continue to serve God, as I mentioned before, despite his suffering. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7, unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Paul also had something else that was at least annoying him in the least. Some have various ideas about his vision, and on it goes. But whatever it was enough for him to call it a thorn in the flesh. Now you think about this, if you have a thorn in your side, you know it. You have a thorn in your finger, you know it. It's annoying. The first thing you want to do is to get that thing out of there. And that's how Paul characterizes this problem. It's a thorn in the flesh. It will not go away. But you know, you think about this, thorns in the flesh come in all shapes and sizes, don't they? Not just physical pain, they come in the shape of other people who might discourage us and cause us to slip away from God. They come in the shape of attitudes that cause us to be discouraged and not attend or serve or learn as much about God as we should. They come in more forms than we can imagine, and they all have one ability to either push us to God or push us away from God. And for Paul, we notice he isn't unfaithful to God, is he? No, he continues to preach and to teach. In fact, he gets thrown into prison later. That's some pain and suffering. If you ever talk to guys in prison, I'm sure back during Bible times it wasn't exactly, air conditioned and having TV like the guys do today on death row. Instead, he was in prison in Bible times, a place you do not want to be. But he continued to do what? He continued to do all he could for God. In fact, most of his writings came from prison during times of pain and suffering. He continued to serve God. So pain and suffering can result in growth when we endure. When we overcome the temptation to give up, we can grow closer to God. When we overcome the temptation to blame God, that's a big one. Something bad happens. We hear people say, well, why doesn't God do something? Why did God allow this to happen? Sometimes people just make bad decisions. As a result, people get hurt. And sometimes we just do not simply know the answer. Some can grow closer to God during temptations when they endure, when they overcome the temptation to deny God. When they do all these things, and that person will grow in faith. James 1 and verse 12 says, blessed is a man who endures temptation. Temptation, again, comes in many forms. You're suffering, you're tempted to do what? Stop going to services as you should. You're tempted to do what? Stop reading and studying as you should. We're tempted to just say, well, God hasn't done much for me lately. I'm not going anywhere today on this Sunday. Those are temptations. A Bible program comes on television. You say, well, I can do this and just stay home. There are those who think that. Had a couple come visit with us in South Carolina. He thought just the same thing. I'll spend my mornings with GBN. That's a great program, but it's not the church, is it? It's not the 5 acts of worship. I'm sure I would, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, if you called them, they'd tell you you should still go to your local congregation. They're not trying to replace worship. They're trying to do what? Encourage you before worship. It's not designed to replace. The Online Academy of Biblical Studies records and broadcasts live services for those who are unable to get out. You know one of the first things they say on their website? This is not designed to replace worship. They don't want you to be staying at home and saying, well, I can just stay home and do this. That's not their reason for doing it. They're saying if you cannot get out, if you're bedridden, here's a way in which you can still be encouraged and not be left out. That's the basic idea. But it's not designed to replace worship. We have sermons on our website. They're not designed to replace worship. They're designed to edify you. But yet we still have those who would say they can just stay home and do something else. Satan uses pain and suffering. It is most definitely a tool which he is well versed at. Because a person many times is at their the weakest point spiritually is when they're suffering. That could be their weakest point, but also could be their strongest point. You hear about stories of men and ladies talking about the Bible on their deathbed. It doesn't sound like they're being pushed away from God. It sounds like they're enduring whatever it is they're going through and still trying to be faithful to God. Job 1 and 2 is an excellent example of pain and suffering. Job 1 verse 11 says, but now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. That's Satan telling God, saying, you just let me take away everything he has, and he'll get upset and he'll take that suffering of loss of possessions and he'll curse you to your face for taking away everything that he has. You know, that's a very legitimate argument, isn't it? We take away someone's possessions, they're going to forget about God. Look at verse 12 of verse 5 of Job chapter 2. Here he says, we know chapter 1 is possessions, chapter 2 it begins to get personal. He says, but stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. 2 things Satan attacks. You notice that? First is his possessions. Because a lot of people are materialistic, so they'll take away everything he has. Well, that didn't do it. Take away some of his children. Well, that didn't do it. Now let's hurt him physically. He got a little upset, but he had some bad attitude and some things he shouldn't have said in Job. We know he repented of it, but what happened? Did he allow some frustration to separate him from God? No, we find he actually repented of those things. And because he was still a servant of God, he actually was told to offer up sacrifices on behalf of his friend to pray for them because he was a servant of God. But we notice what Satan attacks. We can learn a lot of things from Job and learn a lot of things about Satan because of Job. Satan knows where to go to try to cause pain and suffering in our lives, doesn't he? The very first thing he takes away is Job's possessions. You take away someone's house in a tornado, they're going to get a little upset, aren't they? A little discouraged. If they lose their job, they're going to get discouraged. If they lose their cars, they're going to get discouraged. But that wasn't all that happened in chapter 1. We know he took away his children and many of his servants. In fact, all that was left was a few servants that came to tell him the reports of what was going on. Him and his wife and those few servants, that was it. His children were gone. Remember those same children in chapter 1, which Job offered up sacrifices on their behalf because that's how much he cared about them. Now they're gone. Definitely a form of suffering which Satan was bringing upon Job. And that wasn't enough. Chapter 2, he attacks his person. How do we feel when we're not feeling very good? When we're home sick? When we're in the hospital? Waiting for a diagnosis, waiting in the doctor's office? It's a form of suffering. A tool of Satan. Today, however, we can endure, we can overcome sufferings. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the latter part of verse 13. He says, but with the temptation, in our case, in temptation to just give up blame God, because that's what Satan wants you to do, to walk away from God. He says, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. What's one of the things the Bible tells us to do when we're suffering in basically any form, in any fashion? It tells us, first of all, to pray to God, doesn't it? It tells us as Christians, we recognize those who are suffering, to go to them and to what? Pray with them and encourage them. That's how we can get through those sufferings. It also tells us, as we'll see in a moment, to draw near to God. We know that Christ himself also endured suffering. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 tells us that. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Christ has been where we are as well. He's endured hardships. He's endured suffering. He's endured pain. But Christ has also left us an example. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Christ suffered, he endured, we can do the same thing. Well, someone said, well, he's the Son of God. That doesn't make it easier for Christ. You might say, I think easy could say it made it harder on Christ. Until you have Satan stand before you and tempt you 3 times, personally, after you fasted for 40 days, I don't think you can compare your sufferings to Christ. When you're praying in the Garden of Gethsemane for the cup to pass from you so you don't die a cruel and agonizing death, I don't think you can say your sufferings are like Christ. Until you are nailed to the cross and carry the sins of all mankind, we cannot say our sufferings are like Christ. His are far exceed ours, don't they? And so we too can overcome temptations and hardships and pain and suffering. As we close this morning, in order for man to overcome Satan's attempts to use pain and suffering against us, you must draw near to God. James 4 and verse 8 says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. This is where a lot of people mess up, isn't it? If someone sometime is suffering, going through some kind of hardship, it's not physical, well, they can still come to services, but maybe they've lost their job or going through something, but they're still able to come. The point I'm making, we have those who, when something bad happens, the first thing they do is they stop coming to services. Why would you do that? It's like having a severe sickness and illness and saying, well, I know the doctor can help me, but I'm not going. Us guys can be hard-headed and do that sometimes, can't we? But you know, the Bible tells us of a great physician who encourages us to bring our cares, our burdens to him, and he will bear our load, Matthew chapter 11. We must come to God during our times of suffering. If we're not willing to come to God during hard times, then why aren't we really Christians at all? Isn't that one of the greatest blessings of being a Christian, that when things are going bad, we come to God? James 4 and verse 8, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Something else we must consider as Christians is that as Christians we should not be surprised by pain and suffering in all its forms, but we should be ready to endure them. 1 Peter 4 and verse 12 is a verse I think sometimes we need to be reminded of. He says, beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. He's saying, don't be shocked when you endure hard times. We shouldn't be, because as Christians we know one of the first things that Paul tells Timothy is that all those desire to what? To follow Christ will suffer persecution. And so we too should not think it's strange when we go through difficult times, when we have valleys in our life. Because without God, we'll never get out of the valley and get back to the mountaintop, will we? You have to have someone to help you get out of the valley, and we cannot do it alone. We must draw near to God. He says in verse 12, beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. He goes on and tells us to rejoice during those times. It's hard to rejoice when you're in a hospital bed, isn't it? We must remember the tools of Satan and not allow ourselves to become depressed, to become discouraged, but we must draw closer to God. This morning, as you think about these things, that we can encourage you in any way, because that's one of the things we want to do is encourage you. But if we can encourage you in any way, pray on your behalf, we would love and be glad to do so. This morning, if you have any needs or concerns, you can come forward now. That's where we stand and sing to encourage you.